Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Queen Mary and to this inaugural lecture by Professor Warren Boutcher. My name is David Colclough. I'm the head of the English department here, and I'm also an early modernist. My function today is basically to delay the main event a little bit further, so I'm sorry about that, because I'll be introducing our distinguished chair for this evening, Professor Terence Cave. I'm probably therefore doubly redundant, since he will be introducing Warren, and Terence Cave is somebody who truly needs no introduction to anybody in our field, of course. However, I'm going to trespass on your patience a little bit by saying a few brief words about both of them. Warren Boutcher is one of the main reasons that I came to Queen Mary nearly 20 years ago. At the time, he was one of a stellar team of Renaissance specialists, at that time including also Lorna Hudson and Lisa Jardine, and he made this the place to be, really. And his work, which was crossing and continues to cross both disciplinary, linguistic, and geographical boundaries, was and continues to be an inspiration. His interest in pursuing and fostering relations between England and continental Europe is something that he has pursued over many years, passionately and fruitfully. And I'm especially delighted, therefore, not only to see his magnificent two-volume study, The School of Montaigne, launched today, but also to see his wife Rosella and his daughter Stella in the audience. Professor Terence Cave is one of the most important and influential scholars of early modern literature and thought working today. Emeritus Professor of French at the University of Oxford, his publications, but also his contributions to his fostering of a whole host of research networks have shaped the landscape of early modern studies and made it a truly international one with rightly porous borders. From the cornucopian text in 1979, Recognitions, a study in poetics in 1988, more recently, How to Read Montaigne in 2007, and Mignon's Afterlives in 2011, each of his books has had a transformative effect on the field, but also, I think, on their individual readers too. He introduced French literary theory, cognitive literary studies, and much more into the sometimes rather antiquarian world of Renaissance scholarship, well before such subjects were known, let alone fashionable on these shores. The recipient of the highly prestigious International Balzan Prize in 2009, Professor Cave used that prize to establish an ongoing research project on literature as an object of knowledge, in which Warren has participated. I don't want to bring everything back to myself, but I was recalling that I think my very first act, almost, on coming to Queen Mary all that time ago, before I'd even received a paycheck, was to buy from the campus bookshop my own copy of the cornucopian text, having previously borrowed or stolen it from various libraries over the years. I know this because I looked at the inscription in that book earlier today. My very next act after that was, I recall, walking in a state of utter terror to a meeting about team teaching with Warren and Lisa. It was quite daunting. Something which then happened in this very lecture theatre, in fact. They couldn't have been more welcoming to a new colleague, nor Professor Cave's book, more stimulating and helpfully distracting, it has to be said. Perhaps buying a copy of The School of Montaigne tonight would be a good way of imitating my wise actions back then. Hint, hint. In any case, that means that it gives me a special sense of delight to hand over to Professor Cave to introduce my friend and colleague, Warren Boutcher. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The first thing I want to ask is whether you can hear me. I have mislaid my voice. I won't say I've lost it. I hope it will come back, but perhaps not in the next 5 minutes. Hint, hint, he said that you might want to buy one, and this is the moment really to do it, because if you get one of these leaflets, you'll see that says order online at whatever, you know, with promotion code, whatever, to save 30%, and that will bring it down, the 2 volumes, bring it the 2 volumes down to the absolutely bargain basement price of £87.50, which for 500,000 words is pretty good, actually. Try and match it somewhere else. Everyone who knows Warren will be aware that his book has been a long time coming. What is really important to say, however, is that it needed all those years of slow gestation with no corner cutting, regardless of the institutional pressures that scholars nowadays have to work with. I mean, he is a very remarkable example of somebody just getting on with the work of scholarship and not being too distracted by those issues. The result is a dazzling vindication of long-term academic work allowed to mature in its own time. I can guarantee that when you do get your hands on it, whether you buy it, borrow it, steal it, or purloin it in some other way, you'll enjoy the way that it guides you through the European cultural and political ecologies of the early modern period, as reflected in a series of living moments and encounters. And Warren is a brilliant storyteller. His narrative is one of his main things. It's not by any means the only main thing. There are several main things with Warren, but narrative is certainly one of them, and it's very readable. It tells the unexpectedly colourful stories of the people who handled Montaigne's essays, purchased that massive volume, comparable in size, we think, with Warren's own book. Somebody said they thought it might be a bit shorter, in fact, than Warren. The people who put it on their shelves to impress others admired it. We're not talking about Warren's book now, we're talking about the essay. Admired it, talked to their friends about it, and even sometimes read it. And I think that it's absolutely not an accident that Warren has dedicated a good deal of his career to this particular 16th century French writer. In Montaigne's essays, the highly personal signature of the author, his low-key, witty voice, his commitment to human values are present wherever you look. Likewise, of all the academic colleagues I know, Warren is among the most human and humane. He's a real person all the way through, wherever you meet him, wherever you see him, in the bar or the lecture room or anywhere else, whether in his teaching or his research or his day-to-day dealings with friends and colleagues. So I'd like to use the remainder of this introduction to evoke some personal memories of my own, which illustrate his special qualities and skills. The first episode dates back to St. Valentine's Day in 1994, when Warren came to give a paper in the Oxford Renaissance Seminar on Montaigne's search for a manuscript of Seneca in the Vatican. He talked a lot on that occasion about the circulation of books and their material form, the importance of one-off copies in particular places and contexts, and everything he's done since then has been an extension of the core methodology that he established in that early stage of his career. Now, on that St. Valentine's Day, there was a snowstorm. Warren had to remind me of this, and it immediately came back as soon as he mentioned it. His car got stuck in the snow on the way to Oxford, and he arrived late, and he assures me it's the only time he's ever been late for a paper in his life, but I can't vouch for that for myself. And I mention it because one of the metaphors that Warren often uses in his academic writing, and also seems to conjure into life around him, is transport, the circulation of goods and the frictions that can occur in the process. And that brings me to the second episode. In May 2006, I met Warren in Vicenza at a colloquium on the European circulation of Thomas More's Utopia. We flew to Venice together and took the bus from the airport to the train station. We were walking down the platform to catch our train when I realized that I stupidly left my suitcase on the bus. Warren went straight to the bus terminal and sorted it out in his impeccable Italian. I think he could have done it in Latin, certainly French, and possibly several other European languages, because one of the things we just said in a single word that Warren is good at is languages, many European languages. The next time the bus circled back to the station, we have to talk about circulation also in these cases, my case was there. And at the end of the conference, Warren did a I'm afraid the voice is collapsing things to try to move on. It did a brilliant and witty roundup of the papers and conclusions, and he memorably used my lost suitcase as a metaphor for the perilous circulation of books and manuscripts in early modern Europe. I've heard him do other roundups of that kind, some of them even more stellar, but I'm afraid I haven't got time for that now. But for episode 3, we moved to Oslo, where I spent the evening with Warren at a rather mediocre Thai restaurant after a workshop. It was my fault that it was mediocre, it was still. I recall this moment mainly to say something about Warren's politics, since I see him as a kind of incarnation of everything that Queen Mary stands for, in particular, the academic ideal of openness, equality, and freedom of movement. The other distinguished guest that evening in Oslo was Cathy Eden from Columbia, and she and Warren got into a heated debate, well, let's just say it was a row, about the teaching of early modern studies, a friendly row. Cathy took a conservative line, defending the need to focus on classic texts and textual skills. Warren argued passionately that while Cathy's approach might still work for students from privileged backgrounds, those who came from other backgrounds and cultures needed a different teaching style. It was crucial, he said, to take into account the world they were familiar with. In his view, that didn't mean lowering standards or falling into anachronism, as Cathy maintained, but rather a sustained attempt at imaginative outreach, finding points of contact in a multicultural context between the early modern and the modern. That's what Warren does impeccably. So, where next? I must wrap up now. Once again, Warren is setting out to defy the belief that good scholarship can be planned and executed within a period such as the one imposed by national research exercises, assessments, or whatever they're called nowadays. I dropped out of it in 2001, so I don't know the latest acronyms. His next project is a multi-author European literary history of the late Renaissance, date lines 1559 to 1648, commissioned by OUP. I've read the proposal, and it's a hugely ambitious and exciting project with something like 100 authors or something like that, brilliantly conceived. No one but Warren has the combination of detailed scholarly skills and sheer breadth of historical imagination to get such a project off the ground, still less bring it to a successful conclusion. I'm booking my place now for the launch party, which I guess will take place, if we're lucky, in around 10 years' time. I can guarantee, I'm going to get my voice back by then, okay? I can guarantee that it will be well worth waiting for, as will Warren's lecture, and it's time I let you speak, Warren. Your intriguing and topical title is Beyond English, Going Back into Literary Europe. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. My recollection of that incident that Terence was talking about, Venice, Vicenza, is slightly different. What I remember about that is Terence, the revered critic of European literature and Baltzan Prize winner, walking calmly down the station at Venice, Venezia Mestre, and suddenly turning around and saying, "Oh shit," and running like this, picking his knees up like a kind of Donish Usain Bolt, because he realised that he'd left his suitcase on the coach. And I actually think Terence blamed me for that, because I had been trying to engage him in intellectual conversation on the coach. Anyway, I set off after him, and I couldn't catch him, which is unusual because I was quite fit at the time, not so much now. When we got to the coach stop at the station and realised that the bus had gone, something dawned on me, because when it came to Italian language skills, Terence could gloss a Petrarch sonnet much better than I could, but he couldn't chat up the guy who was the radio operator who could get his suitcase back in Italian. My moment had arrived. So if you'll just indulge me for a moment before I start, I do have to thank various people. Obviously Terence himself for that extraordinarily kind introduction, and for being a constant supporter for so long. David Colclough, who introduced Terence, for being such a fantastic colleague for so many years. Bev Stewart, who many of you will know, the executive officer in our school. You'll hear at the beginning of the lecture that I talk about the Sibyl who guided Aeneas through the underworld. Well, Bev has guided me through my first 3 months as head of school while getting an inaugural together, and that is a much tougher task, I can tell you. I want to thank Hannah Swain and the events team, who've done a great job. I want to thank Dave Lloyd and Clive Marsh, the AV technicians. I think, is that Clive and Dave at the back there? I've worked with them for many, many years, very happily, on the Shakespeare lectures, which used to happen in this room. And a bit of internal college politics, if anybody's listening, we desperately need to keep a dedicated AV team, and they are it. I also want to thank the superb e-learning unit, particularly Stella Ecker-Buisi, Brett Lucas and Karen Blankenagel, who provided help with the graphics you'll see. And finally, I just want to thank everybody who has actually turned out tonight. I know what it's like. It's a busy part of the year. It's not that easy to get here by 6:30, and I really appreciate the effort. So it is a big occasion for me, not just because it's an inaugural lecture, but because, as Terence was kind enough to mention, I'm finishing, or I have finished, and I'm publishing one very long project, and I'm starting another very long one, as Terence was describing. And exactly as he said, you can't work in this way, and I actually wouldn't recommend it to some of my junior colleagues, but anyway, I'm a stubborn sort. You can't work in this way on very long-term projects without actually not only individuals, many of whom are in this room, but also institutions supporting you over the long term. And I would just like briefly to single out two, and two women who represent them. I could single out many other people, but I would like to just focus on two. The first institution is, of course, the School of English and Drama here, also the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, and the college generally, which I like to see as integrated entities. And the person I would like to pick out as representative of the best of Queen Mary is Morag Shiach, who was here when I arrived. She was my head of department. She then became head of the faculty, and I worked for her. She was my boss when I was Dean of Taught Programs. And she, for me, sums up the intellectual rigour, the leadership and the personal friendship that I associate with the college. The second institution is Oxford University Press, which is the only press that would have indulged me for so long. And Jacqueline Norton is here tonight. She brought the project home. She's in the front row with incredible style and generosity. The book was originally commissioned as 100,000 words, sometime, I don't even know when. I got into such a kind of tunnel vision with it that I ended up with just under 500,000. I hadn't told Jacqueline it was 500,000. I submitted it. She just said, "Oh, how fantastic." Now all we have to do is decide how many volumes it's going to be in. I don't think any other publisher in the world would have reacted like that, and I mean that quite definitely. And of course now Oxford has channeled me into my next long-term project, the European Literary History. So a fantastic institution represented brilliantly by Jacqueline. And of course what links these two projects together is a European perspective on literary history. And I've assumed that perspective even though I came through English A-level, to an undergraduate degree in English, a PhD in English. So what I really have for you in the actual lecture, which you'll be glad to hear is actually getting underway now, is some reflections on how and why that came to be, with, of course, Brexit looming in the background of everything I say. So just over a year ago now, I interviewed a UCAS applicant from Woodford County High School for Girls, a grammar school about 7 miles up the road from here in Redbridge. The applicant's statement was one of the best I had seen in 25 years of interviewing. Literature, the applicant said, unites different cultures and communities. She had studied international relations through Edward Said's Orientalism. She had come to Chinese history through Yung Chung's Wild Swans and gone on to read the 4 classic novels of China. Her conception of the connections across space and time to which literature gave her access was global. What was I going to probe her on? One sentence was jumping before my eyes. She had included a medieval European author in her roll call of world literature. Reading Dante's Inferno, she said, I was able to explore theological notions through traditional Catholic ideas in conjunction with classical myth. I asked her to choose her favourite episode in the Inferno and tell me how it had enabled her to explore such notions. Mean question, you might say. But she instantly replied that it had to be Canto 3, when Charon, the ferryman who took the souls of the dead to hell across the river Acheron, collects the damned on the shore where Dante and Virgil are standing. What struck her was the way the classical figure of Charon had been turned into a Catholic demon by the Tuscan poet. The literary Charon most important to Dante was Virgil's, in Book 6 of his epic poem, the Aeneid. Aeneas and his band of Trojans, exiled after the sacking of Troy, land at Cumae on the shore of Italia. Aeneas asks the Sibyl to help him descend down through the forest of Avernus to see his deceased father in the underworld. She instructs him to obtain the golden bough, then exhorts him to be courageous as they plunge down together. She secures him safe passage from the threatening ferryman Charon, and they explore the underworld together. In Canto 3 of the Inferno, selected by my UCAS applicant, Dante rewrites this scene with Charon and gives Virgil himself the role of guide on his journey, replacing the Sibyl. So this wasn't a bad answer on the part of the UCAS applicant from Woodford County High. She was so enthusiastic, I asked her whether she had looked at the Italian text. For the first time, I'd found a question that gave her pause. No, she replied. For of course, she'd not been obliged to go beyond English in order to access any of the world literature she had read, from Dante to Yung Chang. It was all in English, either because someone born in a non-Anglophone region such as the Sichuan province of China had decided to write in English, or because a translator had put the text into English. There are great advantages to this. If you have the desire and skill to read in English, you have access to world literature and history. But it is an Anglophone world literature, mediated by the language itself, by translators, by institutions. You cannot see how that Anglophone world literature has been Englished unless you follow the itinerary of particular texts and persons across different languages and places. Not only that, you cannot properly see back to a time in European history when English was the least global of the major Western European languages. Excuse me. For the balance of linguistic and cultural power 500 years ago was very different from now. This that you are seeing is the earliest extant printed map of Europe as a separate geographical entity. It is a map not of languages, but of itineraries or routes. Let's go back to that one, trying to get the laser. There we are. So, Carta Itineraria. You can see that Europae at the bottom. It shows us a perspective from which England and English were peripheral in the 16th century. There were some precedents for maps with this upside-down orientation, so it is the right way up. They were designed to show the routes from the north of Europe up to major sites of pilgrimage in southern Europe, such as Rome and Santiago da Compostela at the top of the image. In this detail, you hopefully see the itineraries from Francia, which you can see down in the bottom corner here. So France corresponds basically to the Ile-de-France, Paris. It doesn't seem to cover the rest of what we now think of as the country. And you can see the itinerary leading down the side here, through Guasconia, which was Montaigne's region, across the north of Spain, through Navarra, on the way to Santiago. You can also see the arms up in the corners, these two on the side, you can just about see them. You can see the arms of the Holy Roman Emperor and of Habsburg Spain, top left and top right. By 1520, when the map was printed, the Habsburg ruler Charles V held both titles. As sovereign, he linked Spain, territories in the Low Countries, territories in what we now call Germany and Austria, and Spanish Naples, the southern half of Italy, more or less. This second impression of the map was dedicated to that emperor in the cartouche, Divo Caesari Carolo, to the divine Caesar Charles. So this is a connected Europe, a Habsburg, Roman Catholic, imperial Europe, a Europe whose languages included Latin, French, Spanish, Flemish, Italian, but not English. In our contemporary world, English people have to challenge themselves and work hard to get beyond English. Why bother when your native language happens to be the main global lingua franca. Back then, you had to get beyond English if you wanted full access to world literature and to be able to converse with strangers. Remember what Mowbray says in Shakespeare's Richard II when sentenced to permanent exile to Europe by the king. Within my mouth you have enjailed my tongue, doubly portcullised with my teeth and lips, and dull unfeeling barren ignorance is made my jailer to attend on me. What is thy sentence then but speechless death, which robs my tongue from breathing native breath? Or what Portia replies in The Merchant of Venice when her gentlewoman asks her what she might say to the English suitor who's come sniffing around, called Falconbridge. You know, I say nothing to him, for he understands not me, nor I him. He hath neither Latin, French, nor Italian. And you will come into the court and swear that I have a poor pennyworth in the English. He is a proper man's picture, but alas, who can converse with a dumb show? Note here that the linguistic options for elite international communication are multilingual, not monolingual. Latin, French, Italian, a run of languages. Unlanguaged Englishmen in Europe lived in speechless ignorance. At best, they were like actors who mimed the outline of a plot without having any lines, the actors in a dumb show. Back in the UCAS interview, if you remember that, behaving suspiciously like the stereotypical Cambridge Don I once was, and who knows, still am, I rose towards my bookshelves, probably stroking my chin, and muttered, "Now, just a minute, where is it?" Luckily, I found the copy of Dantes Inferno, next to my copy of Dan Brown's Inferno, that I had been looking for, and that I had not opened for maybe 30 years. And that is actually true, I had not opened it for 30 years. It was the bilingual edition I had acquired and first used when I was only a year or two older than the applicant. I opened it at Canto 3, and the first lines I saw were these about Charon. Caro un demonio con occhi di bragia, loro accennando tutti li raccoglie, batte col remo qualunque s'adagia. Now this is translated by the brilliant Seamus Heaney, who must be one of the greatest living translator into English in my view. The demon Charon's eyes are like hot coals fanned. He beckons them and herds all of them in and beats with his oar whoever drops behind. So Dante rewrites Virgil's pagan god Charon as a demon and has the departed souls dropping back behind to avoid the crossing to hell. Who wouldn't? Where Virgil's souls had been anxious to cross in his scene because it meant their bodies had been properly buried. Here is Michelangelo's depiction of Charon and the oar in the Last Judgment frescoes on the Sistine Chapel ceiling, though here the souls are dropping behind as they disembark on the other side of the river to go before Minos, so you can see there on the right. So I showed the bilingual book to the brilliant applicant, and she said, "I did not realise you could get it in both languages and learn that way." I hope at least that gave her some ideas. Now, opening this book after so long was quite a moment for me. It was the pencil annotations I found in the book, my own as a 19-year-old, which transported me back. My pencil glosses had been necessary because I was still new to the language. Only a couple of years before reading this Inferno, when I was about 17, I had travelled solo to Italy for the first time as a complete stranger. I had no guide, but of course it wasn't exactly hell. I had learned French and Spanish at school, but not a word of Italian. Literally not a word. I was a dumb show, like Falconbridge. When I wanted to use the public lavatories at Milan train station, I was dumbfounded because there were no symbols to distinguish the ladies from the gents, only words. I guessed that donne should mean men, because it was close to dons, while uomini should mean women, because it sounded like women. A formidable signora who met me on the way into the ladies soon pointed me in the right direction. With languages, you have to start somewhere and you have to be ready to make a fool of yourself. But exactly what was I doing with this book? You can see here that I was glossing the text in modern Italian, probably while glancing at the English across on the right-hand side. This copy, with these annotations, pointed me back viscerally to a moment in my own history and a particular method of learning. I had used a modern Italian dictionary to gloss medieval Tuscan words, alongside an English translation. A multilingual method of learning similar to that used by the early modern elites who needed Latin, French, Italian So you can see there, I wasn't sure what braccia was, certainly not a word familiar to me in modern Italian. I actually turned to Rossella, my wife, in the car a couple of weeks ago and said, "What's braccia?" And she said, "Oh yeah, occhi di braccia in Dante's Inferno," because Italians know every word of the Divine... No, they really do, of the Divine Comedy. Braccia is brace, fuoco senza fiamma, so the coals that are burning without a flame. Why linger over this volume from 35 years ago? It is a personal example of the kind of unique documents that have changed the practice of literary history over the last 3 decades. These documents might, on the one hand, be annotated copies of books, particular editions, manuscripts of one kind or another. But they might also be literary texts considered as documents from which particular kinds of historical experience can be recovered. They might, for example, reveal itineraries of one sort or another. In the case of my copy of Dante, a crisscrossing route between England and Italy, between English, medieval Tuscan and modern Italian. Scholars of Dante, for example, have used the Divine Comedy itself as an archival document revealing the itinerary of an exile banished from his home city, Florence, for life in 1302, an exile who saw himself as a kind of persecuted prophet apostle. Though he is now the archetypal Italian national poet, he was writing then in a competitive multilingual context. Many of his Italian contemporaries chose French or Provençal to write in. Dante exalted Tuscan as the inheritor of the tradition of the Languedoc Provençal in order to debase the Languedoc French. Of course, he did not succeed. So why did the archetypal Italian poet crop up in the personal statement of a UCAS applicant for English? And why had I been trying to read Dante in Italian in my first year of an English degree? We're used to hearing that in the post-colonial age, English literature has been absorbed by world literature. For most writers using English now are too itinerant, too multilingual to be considered a secure possession of the English national tradition. But we are less used to hearing that in the pre-colonial era, English literature always had been embedded in a multilingual, dynamic European network of texts. We do not hear this because the imperialistic Victorians redescribed our relations to other literatures as a matter of sources and influences. Standout foreign influences, such as Dante, Cervantes, Montaigne, were assimilated during the 19th century to the English literary canon, in the same way that Shakespeare was assimilated to the French and German canons. But the other reason why I came to Dante promised another, more European direction. My director of studies at university, Peter Holland, had recommended one book above all others to new students, Eric Auerbach's Mimesis, which had a very important chapter on Dante. As many of you will know, Auerbach was one of the great generation of humanist refugees from Nazi Germany. Forced to leave his post at the University of Marburg, he wrote Mimesis in German in exile in Istanbul between 1943 and 1946. This book embedded the few English texts it did treat in a larger, multinational European tradition consisting of Latin and the major Romance languages. There were no German texts. It was, in fact, one of 2 books published by German Romance philologists just after the Second World War that did this, and the other one became just as important to me a little later. I refer to Ernst Robert Curtius's European Literature and the Latin Middle Ages on the left. The 2 men differed in the way they put together a continuous European tradition. For Curtius, it was all about Latinity and Latin education and tropes through from late antiquity to the Middle Ages. He was presenting evidence of what he called the inner connections of European literature across space and time. For Auerbach, the connected European tradition was more a matter of the vernacular realism that emerged from the Hebrew Bible to challenge the classical hierarchy of styles. But they also had much in common, the 2 men. They were Germans, though Curtius was from multilingual, multi-confessional Strasbourg in the Alsace, which had only just, in fact, become German. They were both medievalists. Their shared key author was Dante, who they held to be the first great vernacular author in any Western European national literature. Curtius wrote that there was nothing in the realm of European literature to compare with the Awakening of Virgil by Dante. Auerbach wrote that no vernacular author before Dante had written so immediately of humanity or human realities with so little truck for artificial rules. Either way, Dante was the key modern link in the chain of the European tradition. So we might pause here to ask, why, in what circumstances, do people reach for a European as opposed to a national identity through culture? Will some British Remainers and repentant Leavers reach out more definitely for a European cultural identity in the wake of Brexit? They might. Auerbach and Curtius needed a multinational literary Europe because their own nation had let them down. Though Curtius was not Jewish and remained in Germany, they shared the Central European experience of Nazism and the Second World War. Curtius became a foreigner in his own country, Auerbach an exile in another country. They were engaged in a literary version of the European project that would seek to reunify the nation-states of the continent, especially Germany and France, after the betrayal of 1940. So back on my undergraduate course in the early 1980s, despite the invitation to read Auerbach, we were actually pursuing a procession of canonical English authors. These included some assimilated European greats, one of which was the late 16th century French philosopher Montaigne, already mentioned, who wrote his essays during the bitter French wars of religion of the late 16th century. He had been translated into English in 1603 by John Florio, whose father had fled Italy as a religious, a Protestant exile. And gasp, that translation had actually been read by the national bard. Shakespeare uses the translation almost verbatim for one passage in The Tempest. Not talking about that today. So even though I was studying a French author and was starting to look at the French text, I was mainly interested in Montaigne as a possession of English literature, as an influence on the greatest English author, Shakespeare. I was still inhabiting, from an Anglo-centric perspective, what I have been calling multinational literary Europe. This remained the case when I started a PhD on the topic. But I got lucky. Purely because of the topic, I was allocated Lisa Jardine as a supervisor, and it was Lisa who opened a whole series of doors beyond traditional English studies. I have to be careful when I talk about Lisa. Lisa, of course, died on the 25th of October 2015 at the age of just 71. She left an exciting and innovative legacy to the humanities, a legacy that we in Queen Mary, and especially in the School of English and Drama, are determined to preserve and develop. Lisa was on leave in my first term of doctoral study in late That was when I started the book. Yeah. Late 1985, and John just confirmed that Sam was born in 1984, so she took late maternity leave. So it was maternity leave she was on when I started my PhD. So I contacted her on the phone for the first time in December 1985 to fix an appointment for the new year. I had never met her, I'd seen her in lectures. I can still remember the old-fashioned payphone from which I placed the call outside the bar in Trinity Hall, Cambridge, and I'm hoping there are one or two people who know that payphone who are here tonight. The vivacious, friendly, urgent voice that came down the line was so different from any other I had heard in academic seminars and supervisions in Cambridge. That voice gave me an intellectual life, a sense of purpose and excitement that has kept me going ever since. I finished my PhD a long time later, in 1991, and 3 years after that left a lecturing job in Cambridge, which at the time was a fairly controversial thing to do, not so much now, to follow Lisa down here to Queen Mary. Though we never wrote anything together, a very wise choice on her part, because it would have taken a very long time, we did work and teach together closely for 2 decades, from 1985 to 2005, after which time changes in her life meant that our orbits intersected less than before. That's because hers was a very large orbit and mine was a very small one. In 2002, she and John, who is here tonight, I'm delighted to say, became godparents to my daughter Stella. So for those of you who don't know Lisa, that's her on the right. There's John, who's here tonight. And that is my daughter, that cherub there, who is now 5'7" of urban ballerina. One of these changes in Lisa's life is relevant to the theme of this lecture. In the early years of the Centre for Editing Lives and Letters, when she moved out of the Queen Mary English department, Lisa began consistently to describe herself as a historian, and it was that description that prevailed in the obituaries. But during the 2 decades I worked with her, she wrote a lot about literature and was committed to a particular version of English studies, or text studies, as she often called it. This form of study followed itineraries into other languages and cultures using other disciplines, such as social history and anthropology. What did this mean in practice for me as I set out to do a PhD on John Florio's 1603 translation of Montaigne into English under her guidance? Well, Lisa said I should get out more, by which, as it turned out, she meant out of England. I had started by investigating metaphors of translation in Chaucer, because Chaucer was the beginning of modern English literature, wasn't he? When she read the tortuous, convoluted piece, and I'm still writing tortuous, convoluted pieces, that resulted, she looked me in the eye and said, "This is not really you, you know." After the subsequent row had died down, we did have a lot of rows, she suggested I apply for some research funds to go to Italy. I remember stubbornly replying that my research topic had no connections with Italy. This was strange, given that my main subject, John Florio, was in fact from an Italian family. Well, find some, she said, and a few months later I was off to Venice to research the Italian translation of Montaigne, which I had never dreamed of studying until she'd made me, essentially. It was this trip that indirectly led to my greatest achievement, because it gave me the confidence in Italian language and culture that enabled me to convince Rossella, my future wife, in Italian, that I was not quite as arrogant and insensitive as I appeared to be in English. Lisa also encouraged me, pushed me physically, might be the more accurate locution, to meet people in other disciplines, especially people in French Renaissance studies who could educate me in the French and Neo-Latin side of things. Some she introduced me to directly, some were drawn to Queen Mary by her, others I met through the connections she gave me. Some of them are here tonight, Terence himself, John O'Brien. Others, such as Quentin Skinner and Evelyn Welch, were in history, though Evelyn joined us later in QM English. I even met or spoke to some anthropologists, including Mary Douglas, the great Mary Douglas, Purity and Danger and all that, who once called me at my flat at 8 a.m. in the morning while I was shaving to ask me what I thought I could possibly know about her discipline. That was a nasty moment. So, when I began studying Florio's translation, I wanted to know what its social and European context might be. What I found was this: an archival document held in the papers of Anthony Bacon at the Lambeth Palace Library. You can just about see that it is a catalogue of books inventoried by language. So, Librorum Latinorum Index, so there's the Latin, Italicorum, Hispanicorum, Italian, Spanish, then there's a miscellaneous section here, Gallicorum, the French books, over on the right, and you can see the prices allocated to each book down the side. These are books that were used by one Monsieur Ledoux, who was teaching languages and literature to elite English clients in the same households as John Florio at the time Florio was doing the translation of Montaigne. The books in the list were published in cities all over Europe, including Basel, Venice, Frankfurt, Paris. There are at least 5 published in England, though only one of them was entirely in the English language, the English Bible, which you'll see in a moment. Eureka, I said. Why? Because the document put Montaigne in England, there it was, Essai de Montaigne, but in French and in multilingual European company. It was an image of European literature, world literature as it was then, if you like, in England. Now, I had been taught that literary Brexit had happened in 2 stages. The first was around the time of Chaucer, 1350, and the second around 1520 with Henry VIII's Reformation. English Renaissance literary culture, after the break with Rome, equated to English writers from Wyatt to Milton building a national English literature. And this is, after all, the picture still offered by the most recent Oxford History of English Literature. In that series of volumes, literature in England is polyglot until 1350, and I'm hoping the author of that is here tonight, Laura. Then we have 6 insulated centuries of Englit for the English, before migrant writers dissolved the distinction between English and world literature after 1948. Yet here was a document of English Renaissance literary culture that mentioned no English authors and that had only 2 texts, here on the slide, containing any English, one of which was the English Bible, already mentioned, described in French, Bible dorée en anglais, and the other a text that used English to teach French, the French alphabet. There were other reasons I was excited by the book list, and you can really tell how sad I am that I got so excited by a list of books. Auerbach and Curtius saw the transmission of European literary culture as a long-standing tradition derived from the classics and or the Bible. The tradition connected Europe together across the ages as a community of the spirit or of culture. But here was another way of seeing it, captured in a document, in a list of actual books owned by an individual in the mid-1590s. This snapshot offered to me something more real, more embedded in social process. It connected Europe, including England, together at a particular moment in specific historical ways. Now, at the time, I assumed that Ledoux, whose books these were, was a Frenchman in England. I was still thinking in terms of bilateral Anglo-French relations. Only in the last few weeks have I discovered Ledoux's true identity. I admit he doesn't look very appealing, but there we go. He was not, in fact, a Frenchman in England in any straightforward sense. Catherine Ledoux, or Caterinus Dulcis, to use his Latinized name, was born in 1540 in Cruces, just south of Geneva, in what is now France, but was then the Duchy of Savoy, or Sabaudia, to give it its Latin name. You can see it there on that original map between Lyon and Bern. At the time of his birth, this is Dulcis's birth, Savoy was occupied by Francis I of France, but it was liberated by a treaty of 1559. Vanished now, Savoy was then as typical of the territories of Europe as emergent nation-states such as France and England. It was on the crossroads between France, the other northern Italian states, and the Swiss Confederation of Cantons to the north, and was divided between Calvinist and Roman Catholic areas. So on this map you can see this is coloured by religion during the time post-Reformation period, and that's a kind of Calvinist tranche there going across from France into Savoy, and you can see what a patchwork it is across this central part of Europe. Savoy had no one language. The local vernacular was Franco-Provençal, or Arpitan as it's sometimes called, which today is on UNESCO's list of definitely endangered languages. It's still around, but only just. The other languages of the region were French, Italian, and Latin for the elite. After his early education in humanism and Protestantism, Dulcis began an extraordinary itinerary across Europe and the Near East. He served and resided with various princes and aristocrats as he went, especially as a tutor to the young nobility. We know about this from the Curriculum Vitae he published in Latin in 1622. He was then professor of exotic or foreign languages, which meant French and Italian, and I think Spanish as well, at the University of Marburg, which centuries later would host both Curtius and Auerbach. The itinerary, if you can sort of mentally follow it on this upside-down map, which is a bit of a task, took him down through France and Italy, across to Constantinople, which is off the map obviously, to meet Sultan Soliman, then up into what is now Greece, until he was imprisoned as a rudder slave on an Ottoman galley. Eventually freed, he ended up on Venetian Cyprus before moving up through the imperial court at Vienna. On the way, in Hungary, he suffered the common experience of being robbed of his horse, money and clothes. He continued up to Denmark, then back down to France, until forced on his travels again by the massacre of Protestants across France in 1572. After a first stay in England, he returned home to get married. But just as he did so, his hometown was ransacked in the clashes between Savoy and France, and he set off again, first to Prague and then to a settled post, finally, as a teacher in Wittenberg, Hamlet's Protestant university. By 1605, he'd settled in the Landgraviate of Hesse under the convert to Calvinism Moritz, which was in the middle of this extraordinary constellation of German states, as you can see here. So the point of this is that the brief stay in England, which I had made so much of in the mid-1590s, when his books were catalogued, was just one very small part of an extraordinary pan-European itinerary. With all this in mind, let's return to that exciting catalogue. In a couple of respects, it does correspond to the European literary tradition of Auerbach and Curtius. It has both classical literature and the Bible, and it has literature in the three main modern Romance languages. But despite the division by language, this document does not point to a multinational literary Europe, a Europe that brings together already distinct national literary traditions. It points instead to a single, multilingual and mobile literary culture, rooted perhaps in the Duchy of Savoy, but in demand across Europe. The list has the same texts in different languages, whether within one volume or across several volumes. It has texts of the Bible, for example, or New Testament, in Latin, Italian, Spanish and English. And it's here that the international Protestant affiliations of the list and of Dulcis himself are most apparent. These were the books of someone who was connected with Protestant intellectuals and movements across the continent, who possessed prohibited vernacular editions of the Bible in Spanish and Italian, but who at the same time was open to a broad literary culture, including quite militant Catholics like Tasso, whose books are on the top part of that slide. And so back to Montaigne on the bottle as well, actually, because he had a vineyard. Here he was, a Roman Catholic author in French, in England, in the hands of an itinerant, multilingual Protestant humanist, using his text to teach French to aristocratic clients. And the secondary eureka moment in relation to this document was that this matched something I had observed both in the London edition of 1603 and in the actual text of Montaigne in French. The London edition emerged from a multilingual context, likewise, in which the local vernacular, English, was used to learn and translate the international vernaculars, French and Italian. The translator and his companions and clients viewed the essays as a book which had successfully travelled and found a welcome in cities across a confessionally divided Europe. Florio's associate, Samuel Daniel, calls this an intertraffic of the mind, a single market in literature, bridging religious differences. As the son of a Protestant émigré, Florio welcomed a Roman Catholic stranger, Montaigne, into English households and acted as interpreter for him. At the very same time, the book itself, the French book, had been written by someone, Montaigne, who was also writing in a multilingual context, playing off Gascon, his local Gascon vernacular, French, Latin, and even Italian, which he used to write part of his travel journal. He expected his work to travel via the book trade to distant parts not just of France, but of Europe, and into the hands of people he had never met, people whose religious and political allegiances might be very different from his, but with whom he could make a connection by means of his book. For the author had equipped the book with a particular kind of noble persona, an infectious personal style that enabled it to travel unscathed. Each copy would be a proxy for the author. It would stand in for him in social encounters on the road, behave like him, speak like him, relate like him. This is what he's telling us in an anecdote he appends to the end of Essay Book 3, Chapter 12, De la Physionomie. Montaigne is saying that his own physiognomy, or bearing, means more than just your face, is much more favourable than that of the Greek philosopher Socrates, whose face and speech could not save him from his famous execution. Montaigne claims that strangers in foreign countries grant him favours on the mere credit of his presence or air, le simple crédit de ma présence et de mon air. That is, they interpret or read him favourably, naturally, he doesn't have to do anything. He likewise is naturally inclined to entrust himself to strangers and, beyond them, to fortune herself. Montaigne goes on to give two examples of situations where he has fallen into danger by entrusting himself to strangers and to fortune and heaven, only to be miraculously saved. In the second example, during the religious wars, Montaigne, like Dulcis earlier, is attacked and taken prisoner, as so many people were on the road, and he's then taken into a neighbouring forest. And this is the translation by Florio, who, remember, was of an Italian family, translating French into English in England. Another time, trusting to a certain truce or cessation of arms that lately had been published through our camps in France, as one suspecting no harm, I undertook a journey from home through a dangerous and very ticklish country, par pays étrangement chatouilleux. I had not rid far, but I was discovered, and behold, 3 or 4 troops of horsemen. I was charged, I yielded, I was taken and immediately drawn into the bosom of a thick wood that was not far off. They had long contestation, argument among themselves for my life, and to say truth, there were many circumstances threatened me of the danger I was in. Tunc animus opus enea tunc pectore firmo. And this is the translation by Florio's associate, Matthew Gwynne. Of courage then indeed, then of stout breast is need, which is a quite literal translation, not a very good one. It's in a rhyming couplet. You have to understand with opus, their opus esse, there is need, or tunc animus opus esse, there is need of courage. Tunc pectore firmo, there is need of a strong breast, a stout breast. Here's a better translation at the bottom of the same slide, again by Seamus Heaney. Now will spirit be tested, now your courage must hold. Remember earlier I said that the Sibyl exhorts Aeneas to be courageous as they plunge through the forest into the cave together. Well, here is that exhortation. At this moment of danger, on a journey in a thick wood, when he is separated from his party of men, Montaigne brings in the words of the Sibyl from Aeneid 6. Nearly 3 centuries after Dante, in a different part of Europe, Virgil's book is still a resource for any educated person thinking or writing about the securing of safe passage on a dangerous journey. Montaigne is inviting the educated reader to momentarily see the episode through the optic of the Latin text and the classical story. When the ferryman Charon sees Aeneas, a living armed stranger, moving through the silent wood towards the shore, he becomes very angry and accosts him, refusing him transit across the river Styx. But the Sibyl speaks on his behalf and presents Aeneas as a famous warrior and as a living image or imago of pietas, which Heaney has as sight of such devotedness, pietatis imago. She then pulls out the golden bough, which is sacred to the goddess of the underworld, Proserpina, from beneath her robe. Charon, very nice to have a golden bough up your sleeve if you have one. Charon's angry breast is becalmed and he ferries the Trojan across unharmed. So there you can see just about the golden bough that she's produced. There's Charon and there's Aeneas looking very distinguished. So what happens to Montaigne? What does he have that will secure him safe passage through the dangerous wood and save his life? We have already heard him say that he trusts to fortune, to heaven, not to Venus and the Sibyl. What about his bearing? That is not a matter of pietas, which is sort of dutifulness in Latin, as in the case of Aeneas. He goes on to relate, this is Montaigne, that the leader of his captors undergoes a sudden change of heart, a bit like Virgil's Charon. This man begins to speak to Montaigne in gentler fashion. Remember, having basically captured him, robbed him, and dragged him into the wood, he suddenly changes. Montaigne is granted his safe passage. His captors even warn him about further ambushes that he might suffer in the days to come. But what, in the absence of a golden bough, was the cause of this change of mind? There had been no deceit on Montaigne's part. He had openly confessed he was not of their party and told them the road that he was taking. One of his captors, who took off his mask and even revealed his name, said that Montaigne owed this change to his face and the freedom and firmness of his speech. The man asked him for a return favour should the need arise. In other words, if he was captured by Montaigne's men. Montaigne concludes, "If my countenance had not answered for me," and these are Florio's words again, "if the ingenuity," that means innocence there, "if the ingenuity of mine inward intent might not plainly have been deciphered in mine eyes and voice, si on ne lisoit au mes yeux et on ma voix la simplicité de mon intention, surely I could never have continued so long without quarrels or offences, with this indiscreet liberty to speak freely, be it right or wrong, whatever cometh to my mind, and rashly to judge of things. This fashion may in some sort, and that with reason, seem uncivil and ill-accommodated in our customary manners. Cette façon peut paraître avec raison incivile et mal accommodée à notre usage. But outrageous or malicious I could never meet with any who would so judge it, or that was ever distasted at my liberty if he received the same from my mouth. Words reported again have, as another sound, so another sense." So Montaigne has no Sibyl, he has no golden bough. He is not a famous warrior whose very presence communicates pietas, but he speaks and judges freely and openly, both in person and in his book. And this demeanour can disarm a potentially hostile captor of both. The circulation of his book is designed to ensure that his words are not reported by someone else and given another sense. His book is him speaking and can connect with a stranger as he can. Even though his fashion, in Florio's word, is not customary, it wins people over. There is plenty in this passage for the tradition of Curtius and Auerbach. Curtius could point to the continuities between Virgil and Montaigne, the trope of the wise man's composure in the face of fortune. Auerbach could point to the vernacular realism of this dramatic episode of capture and release, stripped down from the epic style to give us the ordinary experience of so many people at the time. Their perspectives on what makes for a European textual tradition, their forms of close reading, continue to be vital and important. But I have been trying to add another perspective, one which follows people and texts on the move between places and languages. For this is one way in which we can avoid pre-dividing the map of the literary past into nation-states, as even Curtius and Auerbach did. Montaigne was not writing only for a national French-language literary culture. Apart from anything else, French was being used in many places across Europe, from Savoy to The Hague. Montaigne's sense of the literary cultures for which he was writing was multi-layered. These cultures included his family and friends in his own house and neighbourhood, the regions of Navarre and Gascony I mentioned earlier, the national audience, reachable, yes, through Paris, but also a transnational and European audience. He was sending his book on itineraries of the kind he himself traced on his own 14-month journey through Central and Southern Europe in 1580 to 81. If you came into the lecture theatre early, you will have seen a graphic of that itinerary and noticed its orientation towards Rome. What you're seeing now is the itinerary of his book, which did go to Rome with him early on, but then veered more northwards. Montaigne's personal travels in 1580 to 81 are now described as a voyage through France, Germany, Austria, Switzerland and Italy. But Europe was not so neatly divided into nation-states then as it is now, and as it is on this Google Earth map used for the graphic you're seeing. Think back rather to the maps of historical Europe you saw earlier in the lecture, the ones including Savoy. Montaigne had to traverse a whole patchwork of counties, duchies, city-states, principalities with various linguistic profiles, controlled by parties with various religious and dynastic allegiances. On the way back, he passed, for example, through the Duchy of Savoy. In his journal, he claimed that most people in Turin at the time spoke French, and that the lingua popolesca, the popular language, was a kind of French with Italian pronunciation, which is, I think, his description of what I called earlier Franco-Provençal or Arpitain. So Montaigne would have imagined the itinerary of his book in similar terms as one through multilingual, religiously diverse territories. And the itinerary it did achieve was in reality much more extensive than his own travels in person, as you are seeing behind me. I have visualized it using just a selection of attested and datable editions, translations, copies of the essays across Europe from 1580 to 1640. During that period, it crisscrossed from Madrid to Geneva and across languages from French to Dutch, Italian, English, and Spanish. The idea then of the new project that Terence was kind enough to mention earlier with Oxford University Press, Europe, A Literary History 1559 to 1648, is to use a focus on itineraries and multilingualism to get beyond not only the English but the French, the Spanish, the Italian nationalisation of the literary past. Such a focus can help reconnect cities, people and languages across borders. Each of the 100 chapters, yes, 100, to be contributed by, you agreed it, Jacqueline, to be contributed by scholars from across the globe will depart from a particular datable and locatable instance of a text, a printed edition, a manuscript copy, a document maybe, such as the book list I got obsessed with. The chapter will then work back and forward from that instance to the itineraries and multilingual environments revealed by that text production and circulation history. But a note of caution is needed at this point. It's getting a bit feel-good. For if you value a connected, mobile, multilingual Europe in the present, there is a danger that will shape what you see in the past. Auerbach and Curtius, for very good reasons, wanted to find a multinational European literary union in the past. Late 19th century literary historians wanted to find the roots of their national literatures deep in the past. Perhaps my choice to propose a connected history of this kind follows from my personal formation. In cultural terms, like many of the people in this room, I would hazard a guess, I am a Europhile. My life was shaped by the experience of going to Europe, especially France and Italy, as a teenager, and learning the languages, the food, the manners, the music, the architecture. I do feel as connected to Paris and Rome as I do to Leeds and Edinburgh. Should we now see this type of experience to be typical of a liberal elite whose Europhilia is said by some to have been rejected by the British people? For I am nailing my colours to the mast of Europe at a moment when Europe as a concept, as an object of study, is under attack from many different sides and being asked to surrender. In the Brexit debate, leaving Europe means going global, where Europe is bad and confined and global is good and open. In some strands of critical theory, Europe or Eurocentrism is an entirely negative concept. How can we keep this note of caution in our ears as the project develops over the next 10, 20, 30 years? A couple of provisional suggestions. As Lisa Jardine might have said, and I can still hear her saying it, we should not take the rhetoric of the humanists and their pupils at face value. We should not simply follow their version of literary history. We must pay attention to the limits and conditions of what appear to be transcendent examples of free speech and open-mindedness, mobility and multilingualism. Montaigne may tell a story in which his personal style, miraculously like Aeneas in the underworld, secures trust and friendship from hostile parties, but he did not speak his mind openly on all topics. And there were limits to the possible itineraries of the texts he was producing, and even to the languages that his own principal work was able to transfer into. There were readers who did not buy Montaigne's self-proclaimed franchise, his frankness and openness, who saw it as the pose of a nobleman assuming airs above his station, who did not offer him friendship and miraculously release him without explanation. These noble airs were put on display by means of Montaigne's humanistic education, the style he learned from his teachers. He was the kind of moneyed pupil from a well-off background sought by humanists such as Dulcis, who were selling literary cultivation and multilingualism to the elite as a marker of gentle social status. As John Gallagher has shown, and I hope John is here, this elite fashioned cosmopolitan identities from travel and reading. But how were these identities actually received in social terms by people that had no access to them, the uneducated? Consider another scene in which a cosmopolitan nobleman is captured by hostile parties. This one has a rather different outcome. When Jack Cade's illiterate rebels capture the highly educated Lord Say in the second part of Shakespeare's Henry VI, they expose the hostility to which an elite cosmopolitan identity could give rise, in a manner that has great resonance in our contemporary world. A populist nationalist rebellion seeks to purge a liberally educated class convicted of selling out to foreign nations and cultures. Lord Say is the opposite of Mowbray or Falconbridge at the beginning of the lecture. He is a polyglot, not a dumb show. On the left-hand side of the slide, Say confronts his captors and speaks openly and confidently, like Montaigne, "Hear me but speak, and bear me where you will," off into a dark wood if you like. But he makes a terrible mistake in addressing the rebellious men of Kent who have just captured him. Just as Montaigne does in Of Physiognomy, he throws a Latin tag into his conversation, but this is one which brands Kent a good land full of bad people, bona terra mala gens. In the first quarto text, so it's a different text of the same play, on the right-hand side of the slide, the rebels know only that this Latin tag is a suspiciously foreign and continental tongue, maybe French or Dutch or Italian. Say compounds his error by citing Caesar and by emphasizing how his multilingual tongue had parleyed unto foreign kings. Unfortunately, there is no miraculous reversal of fortune caused by Say's cosmopolitan persona. The tongue in question, along with Say's head, is immediately cut off by the rebels. So we need to assess the social realities and the conditions of mobility and multilingualism and not take the humanist rhetoric too much at face value. And we should not just swing back either from a nationalised literary Europe to its opposite. We must acknowledge and document the emergent forms of literary and linguistic nationalism, while at the same time diversifying the texts, the geographies, the actors that we feature. There will be a chapter on Montaigne, but there will also be chapters on actors who were not even as relatively successful as he was in crossing confessional borders across Europe with his supposedly frank talk. Now, I was going at this point to talk about Sir Toby Matthew, one such actor proposed to me by Alan Stewart of Columbia University, who I hope, yes he is, I'm delighted to see here tonight. But Alan will be as keen as anyone for a drink, so I'm sure he'll forgive me if I skip that. I was going to talk about Juan Latino, whose family was part of the African slave diaspora and who, in spite of prejudice, managed to become a teacher of Latin at Granada and write a Neo-Latin poem. I was going to talk about the Croatian-Hungarian Miklos Rinyi, who wrote Sigurdi Vesedalam, an epic, as Mate Vinca argues, that uses multilingualism as a poetic device to represent the East European borderlands. I was going to point out that popular songs and newsletters can and should be included in this new history. They can be considered part of the European literary culture of the time. They also followed itineraries across borders and languages. But these examples will have to wait for another occasion. Let me finish with just one, an example of a text that followed what is now called a global itinerary. In the 1580s, the Codex Mendoza, a manuscript of indigenous pictorial writing with Castilian glosses, which you can see above the pictograms, compiled in Mexico City in 1541-1542, arrived in England as just one part of its long journey. And you can see a detail here on the right of one of the glosses, muchacho que anda a pescar con su canoa. So the point about this is the way that Castilian was assimilating Amerindian words like canoa and hammock from quite an early stage. Such texts form the beginnings of a long-standing phenomenon redescribed by Goethe through the prism of Romantic nationalism as Weltliteratur, a world literature centred on an interconnected Europe that had extended itself across the globe through colonialism, trade and evangelism. That's where I started, with a young woman drawn into English studies by the access it gave to world literature, which she saw as including European authors from Dante to Shakespeare. Let me end with a young man who took my final year course last semester. He came from a small village of 5,000 people near Turin in Italy, in the Italian part of what was the old Duchy of Savoy. He did Liceo Linguistico, language secondary school in Italy, studying French, German and English. His itinerary took him to an internship in the Museum of Methodism in London and frequently to Shakespeare's Globe. He later became the only one of his Italian school cohort to apply to university in England to study English literature. What attracted him was the emphasis on close reading texts in seminars in the English system, which he did not find in Italy. QM was the only English university to respond, asking him for sample essays and accepting him onto the course. He will be pursuing master's study in English. Here then, in QM, in the tradition of Lisa Jardine, we believe in the inclusive and open and outreaching version of English studies, which keeps its core in the close reading of texts in context, but connects with other disciplines, with other literatures across Europe and the globe. But this does not mean assimilating everything and everyone to Anglophone norms. It means following the itineraries and migrations of texts and people beyond English, beyond England, into multiple other languages and places, especially after Brexit, into Europe. It means attending as much to the limits and barriers those itineraries reveal as to mobility and connectivity. I have not, for example, told the story of how the entire body of essays I wrote on English literature as a student before I started using a personal computer was stolen by the Italian mafia when it was travelling without me between Genoa and Rome in 1991. To hear that story, you'll have to join me for a drink. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Warren. You've heard how much people have appreciated your lecture. I'm not going to say very much, but I will say that you have proved that all the things I said about you in my introduction were not alternative facts, or even topoi from Renaissance rhetoric of praise. They're all true. All of them were demonstrated, in fact, in your lecture, so I was very pleased about that. It would have been embarrassing. I want to just suggest one thing in conclusion, though. I'd like you to adopt a motto, which you know already. If somebody feels like giving you a T-shirt, for example, for Christmas with a motto printed on it, that would be appropriate. The edition of Montaigne's essays that came out in 1588 has on it, which is, for those who don't know Montaigne's essays, the 1588 edition adds a third book of essays to the two that had already come out in 1580, together with lots of very major additions. So it's a work that is proliferating and expanding, right? You need to have that in your head. Because what somebody had put on, I'm not sure if we know who put this motto on the title page. It's in Latin, it's viresque acquirit eundo. It gathers strength as it goes on. Or if you put it into a personal form, he goes from strength to strength. You're going from strength to strength, Warren.
Thank you, John.